The broken seal. The journal smelled like old blood. That was the first thing Dr. Elias Carter noticed when he pried it from the university archives. Not the cracked leather binding or the brittle pages, but the coppersweet reek clinging to the paper, as if the ink had been mixed with something organic. His fingers hesitated over the cover, where a single glyph had been carved deep into the hide. A spiral with 3 slashes through it, like claws raking across a sun. The archive's flickering fluorescence buzzed overhead as Elias flipped to the last entry. Strong Buffalo's handwriting, usually precise and measured, devolved into frantic, jagged strokes near the bottom of the page. One sentence stood out, underlined twice in what looked like charcoal. "Do not speak its name at night." Elias scoffed, but his thumb instinctively smudged the words, as if erasing them could unmake the warning. He nearly missed the scrap tucked between the pages, a dried sliver of something, leathery and veined, too thick to be plant matter. When he held it up to the light, it pulsed faintly, a phantom heartbeat against his fingertips. Elias dropped it with a gasp. The moment it hit the desk, the overhead lights shattered in a rain of glass, plunging the room into blackness. The air thickened with the scent of wet earth and something older, something that curled in the back of his throat like spoiled honey. A whisper brushed his ear, not in Lakota, but in his sister's voice, the one he hadn't heard since her funeral. "You shouldn't have touched it." Elias whirled, but the motion sent his chair crashing into a shelf. Papers avalanched around him, and in the chaos, the journal snapped shut on its own with a sound like teeth closing. Outside, the wind howled through the campus oaks, though the weather app on his phone had predicted stillness. Elias fumbled for his keys, but the metal burned against his palm, branded now with the same spiral glyph from the journal's cover. The pain seared straight to the bone, yet when he yanked his hand back, his skin was unmarked. Somewhere beyond the broken window, a branch snapped, not from the weight of wind or wildlife, but from pressure, the kind that comes from something leaning down, testing its footing. Elias didn't dare look. He already knew what he'd see. The dark shape from Strong Buffalo's cave, its head cocked at that unnatural angle, waiting for him to say its name aloud. The journal trembled against the desk, its pages fluttering like moth wings. A single line of text bled through the aged paper, fresh and glistening. "It remembers your scent." Elias gagged as the air turned rancid, wet fur and spoiled meat, and the whisper came again, this time from inside his own skull. "Run." His legs moved before his mind caught up. The hallway outside the archive stretched impossibly long, the exit sign flickering like a dying star. Behind him, something dragged itself across the floor, nails scoring deep grooves in the linoleum. Elias didn't need to glance back to know it was keeping pace, matching his strides with the lazy precision of a predator herding prey. Then the lights died. All of them. The emergency bulbs, the phone screens, even the glow of the moon through the windows, swallowed whole by a darkness that licked at the edges of his vision. The last thing Elias heard before the silence clamped down was the journal, slamming open again in the empty room behind him, its pages rustling with a sound like laughter. He stumbled into the stairwell, but the steps twisted underfoot, warping into a steep, spiraling descent that shouldn't exist, not in a 2-story building. The railing felt wrong, too warm, textured like sinew under his palm. Below, a faint red light pulsed, rhythmic as a heartbeat, illuminating jagged symbols carved into the walls. They matched the spiral on the journal. They matched the burn on his hand. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and wet fur. Elias' breath hitched as his foot landed on something soft. A dead raven, its wings splayed, beak pried open in a silent scream. Its eyes were gone. In their place, 2 tiny spirals oozing black fluid under the steps. Above him, the dragging sound paused. Then click. A single joint popping the way a predator stretches before the kill. A draft licked his neck, not from the stairwell, from breathing. Something was behind him now, close enough that he could feel the heat of it, smell the rot between its teeth. It didn't touch him, not yet. It wanted him to turn, to see. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, but the darkness behind his lids wasn't empty. Something grinned back at him from inside his own skull, its teeth made of his sister's voice. "Look," it coaxed, sweet as poison. "Look and know." The railing pulsed under his fingers, alive. The spiral symbols on the walls began to drip, the black fluid hissing as it ate into the concrete. Elias forced his legs to move, but the stairs had vanished, replaced by a slope of loose bones clicking like wind chimes. Below, the red light flared brighter, revealing the cave mouth from Strong Buffalo's journal. It shouldn't be here. It couldn't be. Yet the stench of rotting meat rolled up the steps, thick enough to choke him. Above, the dragging sound resumed, slow, deliberate, then laughter. Not the journal's papery mockery, but a wet, gurgling chuckle that split into a dozen voices, each one a person Elias had lost. His sister, his grandfather, the undergrad who'd vanished on a solo hike last spring. They all said the same thing, their words tangling together like roots. "You opened the door." Elias' foot hit flat ground. The stairwell was gone. He stood at the cave's threshold, the broken seal crunching under his boots. The symbols on either side were still intact, but the third, the keystone, wasn't just missing. It had been eaten. The stone around it bore tooth marks. Deep human. His flashlight flickered, casting his shadow against the cave wall, except the shadow didn't match his movements. It cocked its head, smiled. Then it reached out and wrapped long, spindly fingers around his wrist. Cold, solid, real. The whispers crescendoed into a chorus, overlapping in a cacophony of voices he recognized. His thesis advisor, his childhood neighbor, the barista who'd served him coffee that morning. All dead, all wrong. Their words slithered into his ears like worms. "You looked. You know, now you belong." The shadow's grip tightened, and Elias' bones groaned under the pressure. His fingers spasmed open, revealing the spiral glyph burning brighter on his palm, the flesh bubbling like wax. Something moved in the cave's depths. A slow, sinuous uncoiling, the sound of wet hide scraping rock. The air thickened with the scent of scorched hair and spoiled honey. Elias tried to scream, but his throat sealed shut, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. The shadow leaned in, its face a shifting mosaic of stolen features. His sister's eyes, his grandfather's scars, the undergrad's chipped front tooth. It exhaled, and his skin itched where the breath touched him, as if something beneath was squirming to get out. The flashlight died. In the blackness, the cave walls pulsed like a throat. Elias' legs buckled as the shadow yanked him forward, his knees hitting stone wet with something that wasn't water. Behind him, the journal's pages fluttered wildly, though there was no wind. A single phrase tore free, swirling past him in a voice that wasn't human, wasn't language, just hunger given sound. "Feed." The shadow's fingers melted into his wrist, fusing skin to skin in a spiral of searing heat. Elias' vision split, one eye seeing the cave, the other drowning in a memory not his own. Strong Buffalo, trembling as he painted the third symbol, his fingers bleeding, the glyphs drinking his terror like ink. The warrior's scream echoed inside Elias' skull, but the sound twisted, warping into the clicking of joints unhinging. The cave exhaled. The air curdled, thickening into a mist that clung to Elias' lips, his nostrils, his eyelids, sealing them shut with a substance like hardened resin. He clawed at his face, but his fingers met only smooth, featureless skin where his mouth should have been. The shadow pressed closer, its mosaic face rearranging into something almost pitying. It didn't need teeth to smile. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Elias' heartbeat thundered in his ears, each pulse sinking with the red glow deep in the cave. Something stirred there, a shape too vast for the space, its edges writhing against the walls. The shadow released him, but Elias didn't fall. He floated. The cave's ceiling peeled open like a lid, revealing a sky choked with spirals. They pulsed in time with the glyph on his hand. The shadow dissolved into the mist, reforming around him in a cocoon of shifting faces, each one mouthing his name in silent unison. The cave floor liquefied, sucking him down into a current of warm, viscous fluid that smelled of old blood. Elias gasped, but the liquid filled his lungs without drowning him. It tasted like memory, like regret, like the last breath of everyone who'd ever stood where he stood now. Above, the spirals tightened. The cave groaned, its walls flexing inward, ribs of stone pressing against Elias' back. The fluid thickened, hardening around his limbs like amber. He tried to scream, but the resin had fused his lips. The shadow leaned in one last time, its face now a perfect mirror of his own except the eyes. The eyes were still his sister S. They blinked, then winked. Deep in the cave, the clicking resumed. Not bones this time. Scissors. Something was cutting. Elias' vision dimmed as the resin crept over his pupils, but not before he saw it, the journal, floating beside him, its pages flapping like wings. The last entry blazed fresh ink. You are the seal now. The scissors snipped the final thread of light. The fluid in his lungs crystallized, each breath fracturing into 1,000 shards of memory. Strong Buffalo's trembling hands, the undergrad's snapped femur, his sister's last whisper before the car crash. The cave shuddered, expelling him like a seed from a pod. Elias hit damp earth, his body convulsing as the resin cracked away in jagged pieces. Dawn light speared his eyes. He was outside, alive. Wrong, his fingers found his face, smooth, featureless. Where his mouth should have been, the spiral glyph pulsed hot beneath his skin. Nearby, a crow pecked at the remains of a dead rat. It paused, cocked its head. Then it spoke in the park ranger's voice. "You're late for your lecture, Professor." The journal lay at his feet, pristine as the day it was bound. When Elias reached for it, his shadow didn't follow. It stayed curled inside the cave's mouth, watching, waiting. The first page bore new writing, his own handwriting, though he hadn't held a pen. Rule 1, it read. Never look at your reflection after sunset. The ink smelled like wet fur. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen showed 37 missed calls from the university, all time-stamped for yesterday. Yet his last memory was of walking into the archives a week ago. The lock screen wallpaper had changed, too, a photo of the cave's entrance shot at night. In the corner, barely visible, a figure crouched, its limbs too many, its face a blur of motion. Elias' thumb left a spiral-shaped smudge when he tried to delete it. The crow hopped closer, its beak parting to reveal a human tongue. "They're looking for you," it said, this time in Elias' sister's voice. "The ranger found your car." Behind it, the trees bent without wind, their shadows pooling into something with too many joints. Elias' breath hitched, but no sound came out. His throat was smooth inside, like a doll S. Across the clearing, the journal flapped open to a middle page. The words rearranged themselves into a single sentence, glistening like fresh blood. "You have until moonrise to choose the next one." Elias' hand spasmed. The glyph beneath his skin pulsed in time with the cave's distant, hungry heartbeat. Somewhere, a park radio crackled to life. A voice that wasn't a voice mimicked dispatch static. "Copy that," it lied. The crow lunged, sinking its beak into Elias' wrist, not to wound but to pry. The skin split effortlessly, revealing not bone or muscle but a hollow tunnel veined with black roots. Inside, something scurried. The crow's human tongue licked its beak. "You're rotting from the inside out," it said cheerfully. Behind them, the trees whispered names, all people Elias had ever loved, all voices the thing in the cave had swallowed whole. Elias stumbled toward his car, but the driver's seat was already occupied. A figure sat slumped over the wheel, its head lolling at an unnatural angle. When he wrenched the door open, the body tumbled out, rotten park ranger uniform, name tag still polished. The face was gone. In its place, a perfect spiral carved deep into the skull. The journal hissed in his grip. "Rule 2, it added. Never trust a door that opens by itself." The car's headlights flickered on, illuminating the cave mouth 50 yards ahead, impossible since Elias had driven miles from the park. The passenger window rolled down without being touched. A draft carried the scent of his sister's perfume. "Get in," she whispered. The steering wheel vibrated under Elias' palms, not from the engine but from something beneath the car, fingers tapping the undercarriage in a rhythm like counting. 1, 2, 3. Elias realizes the journal's final page isn't paper at all but stretched human skin, still warm. His own handwriting stains it now, the ink leaking from his fingertips like pus. He tries to scream, but the spiral on his face splits open vertically. a zipper of flesh parting to reveal a second mouth inside, lined with his sister's teeth. It laughs. The cave laughs back. The trees stop pretending to be trees. The radio crackles. "Almost dawn," says the crow perched on the dashboard, pecking at Elias' reflection in the rearview mirror, except the reflection doesn't mimic him, it winks. The car lurches forward without ignition, tires spinning in reverse though the road ahead slopes downward. Elias claws at the door handle, but his fingers pass through it like smoke. The journal, propped on the seat beside him, flips to the last page. "Rule 3, it announces, never trust your own heartbeat. The cave swallows the car whole. For a moment there's only the sound of Elias' pulse, too slow, too steady, a metronome counting down. Then the passenger seat reclines. Something sits up in it, wearing his clothes, his skin, but not his face. That's still blank. The thing reaches over and turns the radio dial until it lands on static. A familiar voice, Elias' own, whispers through the white noise. "You should have looked away when you had the chance." The headlights flicker off. The engine sighs. Somewhere, a zipper closes. The dashboard splits open like a wound, revealing teeth beneath the plastic. They're his sister, S. The journal laughs. It's the last sound Elias hears before the car crumples inward, folding itself around him like origami. His ribs crack. His spine bends. The spiral on his face yawns wide and the cave pours in. Outside, dawn breaks. A park ranger radios dispatch about a missing historian. The response is immediate, cheerful, wrong. "Copy that." The ranger turns, just in time to see his shadow peel away from the ground and scuttle into the trees on too many legs. The cave exhales. Somewhere a crow pecks at a scrap of leathery paper. The ink still glistens. The Skinwalker Sugar. "Ranger Vargas." The voice crackled through the radio, too loud for 5:47 a.m. Eli jerked upright in his chair, boot heels skidding against the linoleum. The coffee he'd been nursing sloshed over the rim of his mug. "Go ahead," he said, thumbing the receiver. Static hissed back at him for 3 long seconds before dispatch spoke again. "We gotta, A pause, paper rustled. "Hiker just called in about something weird hanging off a pine near Black Elk Ridge. Says it looks like kids' jewelry. Your closest." Eli rolled his stiff shoulders. The sun wasn't even properly up yet, and already the day was taking a turn. "Copy that, en route." "Yeah." The bracelet dangled from a low branch, swinging slightly in the dawn breeze. Pink plastic, the kind you'd get at a birthday party goodie bag. One side of the clasp was bent outward, not broken but forced. Eli snapped a glove on and turned it over. No engraving, no name, just faint dirt smudges. "Nobody's camped out here in weeks," he muttered to himself. The reservation logs were strict about Black Elk Ridge being off-limits after that rockslide last month. He pulled out his phone, snapped 3 photos from different angles. The forest around him stayed preternaturally still. No birdsong, no rustling, just the creak of pines shifting in the wind. A twig snapped somewhere uphill. Eli's head jerked up. His hand dropped to the bare spray on his belt. "Hello?" The word came out louder than he'd intended. Silence answered him, probably a deer, or worse, a coyote getting bold. He took a step back toward the trail, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Then the smell hit him. Wet dog and something rancid underneath, like spoiled lunch meat left in a hot car. His stomach lurched. The radio on his shoulder crackled to life. "Ranger Vargas, you copy." Eli thumbed the receiver without looking away from the trees. "Yeah, found the bracelet. No signs of." Something moved between the trunks, low to the ground, fast. Not a deer, not anything on 4 legs he could name. Eli's breath locked in his throat. The radio squawked again, but the words dissolved into static. Then from uphill, his own voice called back to him, except it wasn't right. The syllables stretched too long, the vowels distorted, like something trying to remember how human speech worked. "Eli." The radio died completely. The bracelet fell from his fingers as he backed away, heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever had been watching him didn't follow. But as he hit the trail at a jog, one thought looped in his head. That clasp hadn't been bent outward by someone taking the bracelet off. Something had pulled it free from the inside. The drive back to the ranger station took 17 minutes. Eli counted each one, fingers drumming against the steering wheel in a rhythm that almost drowned out the memory of that stretched-out voice. By the time he pulled into the gravel lot, the sun had fully risen, painting the pines in gold light that did nothing to warm the cold knot in his gut. Dispatch met him at the door, eyebrows raised. "You look like you saw a ghost." "Worse," Eli muttered, brushing past her to the cluttered bulletin board. He yanked down the trail maps for Black Elk Ridge, scattering pushpins across the floor. 3 red dots marked the vanished camping groups, all within a half-mile radius of where he'd stood that morning. He pressed a 4th pin into the map, right where the pink bracelet had swung. "We've got a pattern." The maintenance shed door creaked when Javier opened it, the sound cutting through the afternoon heat like a rusty blade. He didn't greet Eli, just jerked his chin toward a dented metal locker in the corner. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oil-stained denim. Javier's knuckles whitened around the fabric before he shoved it into Eli's chest. "Take it. Don't ask." The weight settled wrong in Eli's hands, too dense for its size. Unwrapping the folds revealed an old Bowie knife with a tarnished silver blade, its hilt wrapped in cracked leather thongs. Javier was already halfway out the door when Eli caught his arm. "Who am I not asking about this from?" Javier's dark eyes flicked to the trees beyond the parking lot. "My grandfather buried this with his brother in '78, dug it up himself last winter when the thing came back." A crow cawed from the pines. Neither man flinched. "It's learning your face," Javier added, quieter. Then he was gone, leaving Eli standing in the shed with a dead man's knife and a warning that tasted like copper on his tongue. The knife burned against Eli's hip through 2 sleepless nights. He kept it wrapped in the denim, tucked under his pillow at the ranger station, where the fluorescent hum of the emergency lights drowned out the forest sounds. On the 3rd morning, the radio crackled with a report that made his fingers freeze around his coffee mug, another missing camper. A solo hiker this time, last seen near Black Elk Ridge. The man's tent had been found zipped shut from the outside, his sleeping bag still warm. Eli drove to the site with Javier's knife digging into his thigh through his pants pocket. The tent sat unnaturally pristine amidst the pine needles, its yellow nylon glowing like a beacon. No footprints led away from it, just a single set leading in. When Eli unzipped the door, the smell hit him first, wet fur and that same spoiled meat stench from before. Inside, the hiker's flashlight lay in the center of the tent floor, its beam illuminating a handprint smeared across the interior fabric. Too large to be human. The fingers elongated, the palm wide enough to cradle a cantaloupe. The radio on his shoulder hissed static. Then, clear as day, Javier's voice came through. "Eli, you there?" Eli's thumb hovered over the receiver. He'd memorized Javier's cadence, the slight hesitation before consonants, the way his vowels rounded at the edges. This voice had none of that. It was smooth, polished. "Copy," Eli said slowly, keeping his eyes on the tree line. Static hissed through the radio for 3 agonizing seconds before the voice came back, now with Javier's unmistakable accent, but off, like someone had recorded it and played it back at the wrong speed. "You find anything?" The words slurred together, the R's rolling too long. Eli's fingers tightened around the knife handle. "Just the tent," he said, watching the shadows between the trees. Something shifted there, not wind, not an animal, a deliberate, calculating movement. The flashlight beam caught a glint of Ishin before it vanished. "You at the station?" "Of course," the radio crackled. "Where else would I be?" Eli exhaled through his nose. The real Javier would have said pinch officina or muttered something in Navajo. He thumbed the radio off and backed away from the tent, keeping his steps even. The tree line stayed still now, but the smell lingered, cloying and thick, clinging to the back of his throat. He didn't run until he hit the trailhead, and even then it was a controlled jog, one hand on the knife, the other ready to grab bear spray. Eli's fingers trembled as he dialed Javier's direct line from the relative safety of his parked truck. The phone rang 7 times before clicking to voicemail. Javier's actual voice, gruff and truncated. "Leave message." He tried the maintenance shed next. The line picked up instantly. "Bueno?" The voice was Javier's, but the inflection was wrong, too lilting, like someone mimicking speech patterns they'd only heard in bad movies. Eli hung up without breathing. Through the windshield, the pines swayed in a wind he couldn't feel. He pulled out Javier's knife and laid it across his lap. The silver blade caught the midday sun, throwing fractured light across the dashboard. The bloodied bandages came from the first aid kit in his trunk. Eli arranged them in a deliberate spiral around the cold remains of a campfire pit near Black Elk Ridge, adding his own pocket knife for good measure, the blade smeared with ketchup from yesterday's lunch. He snapped photos with his phone, then tossed the device into the underbrush 15 feet away. The ash bucket sat heavy against his hip as he climbed into the game warden's blind, its weathered wood creaking under his weight. Javier's knife balanced across his knees, edge facing outward. The blind smelled of mildew and old sweat, its wooden slats pressing uncomfortably into Eli's ribs as he settled into position. Below, the false campsite lay bathed in shifting moonlight, bandages curled like dead leaves, the ketchup-streaked knife glinting dully. His own breath sounded too loud in the cramped space. He counted seconds between heartbeats, focusing on the cool weight of Javier's blade against his thighs. 23 minutes passed before the first twig snapped. It came from due east, just beyond the tree line. Eli's fingers tightened around the knife handle. Another snap, closer this time. Then silence. The wind died abruptly, leaving the forest holding its breath. Sweat trickled down his temple despite the chill. He willed himself still, eyes fixed on the spot where the noise had originated. The thing emerged in increments, first a shadow darker than the surrounding night, then the slow reveal of limbs that bent wrong at the joints. It paused at the edge of the clearing, head cocked at an angle no human neck could achieve. Moonlight slid over its silhouette, revealing patches of mismatched skin stitched across its torso like a grotesque quilt. Eli's stomach lurched when he recognized the National Park Service tattoo on its forearm, the same one missing camper Rick Torres had shown him last month over beers at the station. The creature crouched over the staged bloodstains, its spine emitting a wet, crunching sound as it rearranged itself. Long fingers probed the bandages, bringing a strip to where its mouth should have been. Eli saw the moment it realized the deception, the whole body tensing, that terrible spine arching upward like a startled cat's. He didn't wait for it to turn. The ash left Eli's fingers in a wide, arcing throw, scattering across the creature's hunched shoulders like gray snow. It didn't scream, not at first. The sound started as a wet gurgle deep in its throat, bubbling upward until it shattered the night's silence into jagged pieces. Moonlight caught the particles midair, illuminating the creature's true form for one suspended heartbeat. Elongated limbs knobbed with too many joints, a face that kept trying and failing to hold a human shape. Patches of skin slewed off where the ash touched, revealing blackened muscle beneath. Eli was already moving as the thing writhed, silver knife flashing downward. The blade bit deep, not into flesh, but into something fibrous and tough, like cutting through wet rope. The shriek that followed knocked him backward, his skull connecting with the blind's wooden frame hard enough to see stars. He rolled sideways as talons raked the space where his throat had been, splinters raining down from the shredded wood above him. The knife was still embedded in the creature's shoulder when he kicked out blindly, his boot connecting with its ribcage. The impact sent a jolt up his leg, the sensation like kicking a sack of gravel. Then it was gone. Not running, not fleeing, just gone, the space where it had crouched now empty except for a smear of viscous black fluid steaming in the cold air. Eli scrambled to his knees, fingers closing around the fallen knife. The blade came away clean. No blood, no ichor, just silver gleaming under the moon as if freshly polished. Dawn arrived in hesitant increments, light seeping through the pines like slowly spilled ink. Eli sat with his back against a tree at the clearing's edge, Javier's knife balanced across his thighs, watching the ash-strewn ground where the thing had stood. His radio crackled twice, dispatch checking in, but he let the calls go unanswered. The rising sun reduced the black stains to wisps of smoke that curled upward before dissipating entirely. By full daylight, only 3 pieces of evidence remained. The untouched bandages, Eli's own shallow claw mark across his collarbone, and a single long, dark hair caught on a pine branch, too coarse to be human. The hair curled around Eli's gloved finger like a question mark, coarse enough to feel through the latex. He sealed it in an evidence bag with hands that barely shook, a small victory. The claw marks stung under his shirt, but he ignored them as he trudged back toward the trailhead. The morning sun painted everything in deceptively cheerful light, turning the pine needles into golden spears. Javier's truck sat exactly where it always did outside the maintenance shed, but the driver's side door hung open, keys dangling from the ignition. Eli approached slow, knife drawn. The shed's interior smelled of oil and stale coffee, the usual clutter of tools undisturbed. Then he saw the boot toes peeking from behind a stack of tire chains. Javier lay face up, eyes open and clouded. Dead at least a day, maybe 2. The skin around his mouth had split in a grimace too wide for human anatomy, as if something had stretched the flesh outward from the inside. Eli's radio chose that moment to crackle to life, dispatch again, her voice tinny through the static. Ranger Vargas, respond. We've got reports of... The transmission cut off mid-word, replaced by a burst of white noise that resolved into perfect silence. Eli reached for the radio with his free hand, then froze. The static had returned, but beneath it something breathed. Slow. Wet. The sound of saliva moving between too many teeth. He thumbed the volume down instead of replying, listening as the breathing grew louder, closer, until he could almost feel it on the back of his neck. Eli didn't turn around. The shed's corrugated metal walls creaked as something shifted behind him, not footsteps, but the sound of weight redistributing across too many joints. The breathing hitched, then smoothed into an approximation of human rhythm. When the radio static cleared, his own voice came through, flawless and calm. Everything okay in there? His fingers tightened around Javier's knife. The blade caught a sliver of sunlight from the open door, casting a thin silver line across Javier's staring eyes. Eli took 3 measured steps backward, keeping the knife between himself and whatever stood near the tire irons. The smell hit him then, wet earth and spoiled milk, undercut with something metallic. Fine, Eli said to the radio. The lie tasted like copper. Static, then almost playful, liar. Eli's pulse hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird as he edged toward the shed door. The radio slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete with a plastic crack that echoed too loud in the confined space. Behind him, something chuckled, a wet, clicking sound that didn't match the shape of human laughter. Sunlight burned his eyes as he stumbled backward into the parking lot. The knife trembled in his grip, its silver edge catching the morning light in jagged streaks. The shed door swung shut with a resonant clang, cutting off whatever stood inside. Eli didn't wait to see if it followed. He sprinted for his truck, keys already in hand, and wrenched the door open. The engine roared to life like a startled animal. 20 miles down the mountain, his hand still hadn't stopped shaking. The radio remained stubbornly silent, its display dark despite 3 attempts to power cycle it. Eli pulled over at a scenic overlook, gravel crunching beneath the tires. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, pale, sweating, with a scratch across his collarbone that oozed sluggish red. His own eyes looked unfamiliar. The knife lay on the passenger seat, wrapped once more in Javier's denim. Eli reached for it, then stopped. The fabric twitched, not from the wind, not from the idling engine. A slow, deliberate movement like something stirring beneath the cloth. He recoiled, elbow knocking against the door handle. The denim bundle slid to the floor with a muffled thump. The denim twitched again, a lazy, almost mocking ripple. Eli held his breath, watching as the fabric settled into stillness. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then, with agonizing slowness, the corner of the denim began to peel back on its own, revealing a sliver of the silver blade beneath. Eli's hand shot out, slamming the truck door shut with enough force to rattle the windows. The sound seemed to startle whatever lay beneath the fabric. The denim stilled. Outside, a raven landed on the overlook's wooden railing, tilting its head to peer into the cab with unsettling familiarity. The radio hissed to life without warning, blaring static loud enough to make Eli jerk away from the steering wheel. When the noise cleared, Javier's voice emerged, but warped, stretched thin like a recording played at half speed. "You can't leave us." Eli stomped on the gas before the last syllable finished. The truck fishtailed onto the asphalt, spraying gravel. In the rearview mirror, the Raven took flight, wings beating in perfect synchrony with the static pulsing from the radio. He reached over and yanked the power cord from the dashboard. Silence flooded the cab, broken only by his own ragged breathing. The truck's speedometer needle trembled at 75 as Eli hit the county highway, pine trees blurring into a green smudge on either side. His knuckles ached around the steering wheel. The denim bundle hadn't moved again, but the passenger seat floor now bore 3 parallel scratches in the rubber matting, fresh, deeper than any human fingernail could make. A road sign flashed by, next services 32 miles. Eli exhaled through his nose. The radio remained dead, but the silence felt watchful. He risked a glance at the rearview mirror. Empty highway stretched behind him, sunlight glaring off the asphalt. Then movement, not on the road but reflected in the glass itself. Something shifted in the truck bed with a hollow thump. Eli didn't brake, didn't react at all except to tighten his grip on the wheel. The rearview mirror showed only his own bloodshot eyes now. He counted breaths until the next bend in the road, then flicked his gaze to the side mirror. The truck bed's corrugated metal gleamed empty under the midday sun. A single raven kept pace overhead, wings spread wide against the blue. The gas station appeared like a mirage, a lone pump island with a bulletproof booth and flickering open sign. Eli pulled in with tires screeching, parking directly under a buzzing halogen light despite the daylight. The attendant barely glanced up from his phone as Eli burst through the door, bell jangling wildly. The gas station smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Eli grabbed 2 protein bars and a bottle of water, tossing them onto the counter with enough force to make the attendant finally look up. "42.50, the kid muttered, eyes already sliding back to his phone screen. Eli fumbled with his wallet. His fingers brushed against Javier's knife, still wrapped in denim and shoved deep in his jacket pocket. The fabric felt warm, too warm. The attendant's fingers froze mid-swipe when Eli's credit card came away streaked with blackish red. Cut myself," Eli said, too quickly. The lie tasted like pennies. The kid blinked at the claw marks peeking from Eli's collar but said nothing, just handed back the card with 2 fingers like it might bite. The bell jangled again as Eli pushed outside. His truck sat exactly where he'd left it, passenger door slightly ajar. He slowed. He'd definitely shut it. The raven from earlier perched on the roof now, head cocked toward the truck bed. Eli approached sideways, knife sliding into his palm beneath the denim. The truck bed was empty except for Javier's maintenance uniform, neatly folded, the sleeves arranged to cradle his missing pocket knife. The raven cawed once and took flight, its shadow skimming across the fabric like a reaching hand. Eli's own reflection stared back from the truck's rear window, distorted by dust and spiderweb cracks. Then the glass fogged over, not from his breath, but from the inside. Eli lunged backward as something thumped against the cab's interior roof. The parked truck rocked on its shocks. The gas station attendant finally looked up from his phone, squinting through the booth's bulletproof glass. Eli raised a palm in what he hoped passed for reassurance while his other hand tightened around the knife. The truck stilled. The fogged window cleared in uneven streaks, revealing 3 long scratches across the glass, fresh, deep, angled like something had dragged claws downward while hanging upside down from the ceiling. The denim bundle in his pocket twitched violently. Eli stumbled back, knocking over a display of motor oil. The attendant's muffled yell barely registered as the truck's radio flared to life despite being unplugged, blaring static that resolved into overlapping voices. Javier's, his own, the missing campers, all chanting "Too late, too late, too late" in perfect unison. The truck's headlights flickered once, twice, then died with a sound like a sigh. Eli ran, not toward the highway, but into the pines bordering the gas station, branches whipping at his face as he crashed through underbrush. The forest smelled of sun-warmed sap and disturbed earth. Behind him, metal groaned as the truck door swung open on protesting hinges. No footsteps followed, just the creak of something heavy shifting in the cab, then the wet click of too many joints realigning. The pine needles whipped past Eli's face like thin blades, each breath burning hotter than the last. He didn't dare look back. The absence of footsteps was worse than any pursuit. Only the radio's static followed him, bleeding through the trees in erratic bursts. His boot caught on a root. He pitched forward, Javier's knife flying from his grip. The blade spun end over end before embedding itself in the moss with a soft thunk. Eli scrambled toward it on hands and knees, fingers closing around the hilt just as the forest fell silent. No wind, no birds, just his own heartbeat thrashing in his ears. Then from the direction he'd come, the crunch of gravel underfoot, deliberate, unhurried. Not the erratic gait of something running. The footsteps of something that knew exactly where he was. The knife came up on instinct. Eli pressed his back against the nearest pine, bark digging through his shirt. 30 yards ahead, sunlight pooled in a small clearing where a fallen log bridged a narrow creek. His only chance. He counted the steps between himself and the water, 10 long strides, and lunged. The thing behind him matched his movement with a wet cartilage pop sound. Eli didn't turn. He hit the log at full speed, boots skidding on damp wood. The creek burbled innocently below, its clear water reflecting the sky in broken pieces. Something in that reflection moved wrong. Eli leapt. The water hit Eli like a slap, colder than he expected, driving the air from his lungs. He surfaced gasping, knife still clenched in his fist. The creek's current tugged at his legs, surprisingly strong for something barely knee-deep. Behind him, the log remained undisturbed. No pursuing silhouette. No sound at all except the water chuckling over smooth stones. Then his own voice echoed from the bank. "You can't swim forever." The words had that stretched quality again, vowels distended like taffy. Eli twisted toward the sound. His reflection stared back from the water's surface, except it wasn't mirroring him. His doppelganger smiled with too many teeth, its head cocked at that impossible angle. The eyes were wrong, pupils vertical, slitted. Eli plunged the knife into the reflection. Silver blade met water with a hiss like a hot iron. His doppelganger's face rippled, features dissolving into a swirl of black tendrils that dispersed downstream. The creek bed shifted underfoot, not rocks moving, but something beneath them. Eli staggered backward as the water turned opaque, clouding from below like ink spreading in milk. He scrambled for the opposite bank just as the first pale fingers breached the surface. Not human fingers, too long, too jointed. They grasped at his boots with horrible precision. Eli slashed downward, severing 2 at the knuckle. They dissolved into black smoke before hitting the water. The rest retreated with a wet pop. Eli hauled himself onto the opposite bank, water streaming from his clothes as he rolled onto his back. The creek bubbled violently for 3 heartbeats, then stilled, clear again. A severed finger floated to the surface, pale as a dead fish. It dissolved before his eyes, leaving only a wisp of black vapor that curled upward and vanished against the sun. The silence lasted exactly 14 seconds. Then the forest exhaled. From the direction of the gas station, Metal screamed, the sound of his truck's roof buckling inward. Eli pushed himself upright, knife dripping in his shaking hand. No birds took flight. No animals bolted. The pines stood motionless, their needles holding their breath. A single raven landed on the fallen log he just crossed, tilting its head to examine him with knowing eyes. Eli's radio, still clipped to his belt despite everything, crackled to life. Static resolved into overlapping whispers, Javier's voice, his own, the missing campers, all murmuring the same word. Run, 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 run. He tore it free and hurled it into the creek. The water swallowed it with a hungry glug. The raven didn't flinch when Eli scrambled to his feet. It just watched, beak slightly parted as if tasting the air between them. Then it cawed, not the harsh cry of a wild bird, but 3 measured notes that sounded almost like laughter. The sound echoed between the trees in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Eli backed away, knife raised. His boots sank into the creek bank's soft earth, leaving perfect impressions that immediately filled with dark water. Something about those footprints made his skin crawl, too defined, too easy to follow. He turned and crashed through a thicket of young pines, their needles whipping across his face like 100 tiny knives. 200 yards uphill, his lungs burned. The forest had gone quiet again, the kind of silence that presses against eardrums like deep water. Then a new sound, plastic rustling. Eli froze beside a lightning-scarred Douglas fir, watching as a yellow tent materialized between the trees ahead, impossibly pristine, its rainfly taut despite no stakes anchoring it to the forest floor. The same tent from the missing hiker's campsite. The zipper trembled. The zipper trembled, not from wind, but from the inside, each tooth rattling against its neighbor in a staccato rhythm. Eli's breath fogged the knife blade as he edged closer, boots sinking into moss that released the scent of wet earth and something darker. The tent's fabric bulged irregularly, as if something large were testing the confines from within. 3 feet away, the zipper began sliding open on its own. Not the smooth glide of human hands, but the jerky, incremental motion of something learning how the mechanism worked. Eli dropped to a crouch just as the flap parted enough to reveal a sliver of interior. The stench rolled out first, spoiled meat and that unmistakable wet fur tang. Then movement, fingers pressing against the nylon from inside. Human fingers, too human. Rick Torr's voice emerged from the darkness, slurred with sleep. Eli, that you? The tone was perfect. The same gravelly inflection the missing camper had used when complaining about blisters last month. But Eli had watched Rick's skin being stitched across that thing's ribs 2 nights ago. The zipper reached halfway before seizing. The fingers curled inward, nails scraping the fabric with a sound like knives being drawn. Eli lunged. The knife punched through nylon with a wet crunch. The tent collapsed inward with a sound like a sigh, not the gasp of punctured air, but something organic, almost relieved. Eli wrenched the blade free as the fabric convulsed, a dark stain spreading outward in branching rivulets. Too much blood for a single wound. Then the screaming started. Not human screams, not animal. The sound vibrated through Eli's molars, a frequency that made his vision blur. The tent flailed like a dying thing, its poles snapping with bone cracks. A hand burst through the side panel, Rick's hand, complete with the silver ring Eli remembered. But the fingers kept elongating, joints popping as they curled around Eli's ankle with terrifying gentleness. Eli brought the knife down in a silver arc. The blade severed tendons with a sound like cutting wet paper. The fingers spasmed but didn't let go. Behind them, the tent's remains shuddered apart like a molting insect, revealing a nightmare in progress. Rick's face stretched over something with too many ribs, his mouth unhinging vertically as the scream resolved into words. You left us in the dark. The fingers around Eli's ankle tightened, not with force, but with intimate precision, each digit molding to the contours of his boot like it had memorized the shape. Rick's face sagged from the thing's skull like melted wax, his National Park's tattoo stretched across a ribcage that pulsed with uneven breaths. The silver knife trembled in Eli's grip as he raised it again, but the thing spoke first, its voice shifting mid-sentence from Rick's drawl to Javier's accented English. "You don't want to do that." Eli stabbed downward. The blade sank into the thing's forearm up to the hilt, but no blood welled, just a slow seep of black fluid that smoked where it touched the moss. The fingers finally released him with a sound like Velcro tearing. Eli scrambled backward, knife still embedded, watching as the creature's skin rippled where the silver touched it. The tent fabric hissed against the forest floor, writhing like a living thing as the creature extracted itself with grotesque patience. Eli ran before it finished standing. The trees blurred past him, branches whipping at his arms as he crashed through underbrush with no direction except away. His breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale puffing white in air that had turned suddenly frigid. Behind him, something moved with that same terrible wet pop of rearranging joints. The clearing opened before Eli like a wound, too sudden, too symmetrical to be natural. Moonlight pooled between the pines, illuminating a circle of flattened grass and the unmistakable silhouette of Javier's maintenance shed at its center. Impossible, he'd run downhill, away from the station. The shed's door gaped open, light bleeding out in a yellow rectangle that ended abruptly at the tree line. Inside, shadows moved with human rhythm. Eli's knife hand shook. The blade was gone, left buried in that thing's flesh back at the tent. His palms stung where bark had torn them open during his flight. The shed's light flickered once, twice, then steadied. A radio crackled inside, actual static, not the warped voices from before. Eli took a step forward, then another. His boot sank into something wet. Blood spread outward from beneath the shed door in a slow, dark tide. Not fresh, coagulated, with a film of iridescence floating atop it like gasoline on water. The radio static rose in pitch, resolving into a Navajo chant Eli recognized from Javier's truck tapes last summer. A shadow crossed the doorway. Then another, both unmistakably Javier's profile. Eli's breath hitched. The shed's interior was wrong, too deep, the back wall lost in darkness despite the small building's actual dimensions. Tools hung suspended from the ceiling on lengths of twine, swaying without wind. Between them dangled strips of something that glistened wetly in the lamplight. Eli's boots made no sound as he stepped into the blood slick. The liquid parted around his soles like oil, clinging in perfect crimson crescents that refused to drip. Inside the shed, Javier's shadow paused mid-reach for a hanging wrench, then turned its head further than human anatomy allowed. The lamplight caught its profile. Javier's nose, Javier's stubble, but the eyes were all wrong, pupils swallowing the irises whole. The radio chant stuttered into silence. From the rafters, one of the glistening strips detached with a wet snap, landing at Eli's feet with a sound like raw meat hitting a counter. Skin. Human forearm skin, the National Park's tattoo still visible beneath a sheen of lymph. The edges were too precise, as if removed with surgical care rather than torn. "You're late," said the shadow. Its voice was Javier's, but the words came out in perfect sync with the second shadow moving behind it, a half-second delay, like a bad dubbing. Eli's hand went to his empty belt where the knife should have been. The Javier thing smiled, revealing molars that tapered to needle points. "Looking for this." It held up the silver knife between thumb and forefinger, blade balanced precariously on its palm. The metal gleamed unnaturally bright in the lamplight, untouched by the black fluid that had smoked from the creature's wound earlier. Behind it, the shed's back wall shimmered, not a wall at all but a curtain of stitched-together clothing. Rick's flannel, a child's sequin backpack, Javier's maintenance overalls, all suspended from something that pulsed rhythmically in the darkness beyond. The Javier thing's fingers flexed around the knife hilt, too many knuckles bending in wrong places, as the shed's single bulb began swinging on its cord. Shadows leapt across the stitched clothing curtain, stretching and contracting like breathing lungs. Eli's own breath came shallow now, his pulse hammering against the claw marks on his collarbone. The wound burned hotter the closer he stepped toward the knife. "Not real," Eli whispered. A mantra, not a statement. The Javier thing's smile widened at the words, seams of its face stretching dangerously thin. Behind it, the second shadow detached from the wall and resolved into something approximating Eli's own lanky frame, complete with the Park Service badge dangling from its neck. The doppelganger's hands hung limp at its sides, fingers twitching in perfect sync with Eli's own trembling. The bulb's swinging intensified. The shed's walls groaned, not wood settling but an organic creaking like tendons under strain. Eli's vision swam as the stench of copper and spoiled milk thickened. His reflection in the Javier thing's black eyes showed a man already half lost. Shirt torn, lips cracked from dehydration, pupils blown wide with adrenaline. The knife gleamed between them like a dare. Eli lunged. Eli's fingers closed around the knife hilt, cold silver biting into his palm, just as the Javier thing's face split vertically with a sound like tearing canvas. Behind it, his doppelganger lunged with identical motion, its fingers elongating into talons mid-reach. Eli twisted sideways, bringing the blade up in a desperate arc. The silver connected with something fibrous and unyielding. The shed erupted. Nails burst from the walls like shrapnel, embedding in Eli's shoulders as the stitched clothing curtain tore apart. What lay beyond wasn't darkness, but a pulsing mass of mismatched flesh. Rick's face screaming beside a child's stitched-on hand. Javier's tattoo stretched across a ribcage that expanded and contracted like bellows. The knife stuck fast in the thing's center, smoking where silver met unnatural tissue. Eli wrenched it free as the doppelganger's talons grazed his throat. He rolled under a workbench, feeling the wood splinter above him as something heavy came down. The Javier thing's shadow loomed suddenly close, its distorted mouth forming words that matched the radio's returning static, almost out of time. Eli's back hit the workbench's leg with a crack that sent pain lancing up his spine. The Javier thing loomed over him, its split face dripping black ichor that sizzled where it struck the concrete floor. The knife trembled in Eli's grip, too light, suddenly, as if the silver had been drained of its weight. Behind the creature, his doppelganger unfolded to its full height, joints popping like kindling in a fire. The radio static surged, resolving into a chorus of overlapping voices. Rick's panicked cursing, Javier's Navajo prayers, a child's giggle, all repeating the same phrase. Almost out of time. The shed's single bulb exploded in a shower of glass, plunging the space into darkness save for the eerie bioluminescence now pulsing from the stitched flesh curtain. Eli kicked upward, his boot connecting with the Javier thing's knee. The joint bent sideways with a wet snap, but the creature didn't stagger. It simply rotated the leg 180 degrees with a sound like a rusted hinge. Its fingers brushed Eli's cheek, freezing cold and textured like tree bark. The knife came up on instinct, slicing through the reaching hand at the wrist. The severed fingers dissolved midair into a swarm of black beetles that scattered across the floor. The doppelganger lunged. Eli rolled sideways, feeling talons graze his ribs as they tore through his uniform shirt. His elbow struck something metal, a gasoline canister left tipped on its side. The scent of fuel flooded the shed as he fumbled for the cap with his free hand. The Javier thing loomed closer, its breath fogging the air between them in quick, eager bursts. Eli twisted the gas cap one-handed, fingers slipping on sweat-slick metal. The doppelganger's talons missed his face by inches, embedding in the workbench with a splintering crack. Fuel sloshed over his wrist, cold, reeking of volatile chemicals. The Javier thing's breath hitched in recognition, its pupil-less eyes flicking to the canister just as Eli hurled it. The container spun end over end, spewing a glittering arc of gasoline across the creature's chest. The Javier thing recoiled with a wet screech, arms crossing instinctively over its face. Eli didn't wait. He struck the knife against concrete, sending sparks skittering across the fuel-drenched floor. Fire erupted in a blue-white wave. The Javier Thing's scream fractured into multiple voices: Rick's baritone, Javier's rasp, a child's wail, as flames licked up its distorted body. The shed's walls buckled inward, timbers groaning like dying animals. Eli scrambled backward through the doorway as his doppelganger lunged through the inferno, its flesh blackening even as it reformed, muscle fibers knitting together with audible pops. The heat hit Eli like a wall as he stumbled backward into the clearing, not the dry burn of wildfire, but something thicker, almost alive in its intensity. The shed's windows shattered outward in a spray of glass and embers, but the flames inside burned unnaturally blue, casting long shadows that twisted like puppets on strings. A shape moved within the inferno, elongating and contracting with that same wet-pop rhythm. Eli's lungs seized as smoke coiled down his throat, not wood smoke, but something acrid and chemical, clinging to his tongue like battery acid. The knife trembled in his blistered hand, its silver blade now streaked with soot and something darker that evaporated even as he watched. Behind him, the trees stood unnaturally still, their branches frozen mid-sway as if holding their breath. Then the screaming stopped. The sudden silence rang louder than the fire. Eli crouched, knife raised, watching as the shed's roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks. No movement inside, no silhouettes, just flames devouring the structure with methodical precision, leaving Javier's maintenance manuals curling to ash in their wake. Eli exhaled through his teeth, then froze as his breath fogged the air despite the heat. Eli's breath hung suspended in the cold air, too cold for the inferno still roaring behind him. The fog from his lips curled unnaturally, twisting into shapes that resembled grasping fingers before dissipating. His reflection stared back at him from the knife's soot-streaked blade, hollow-eyed, with a trickle of blackened blood running from one nostril. The silver felt heavier now, humming against his palm like a struck tuning fork. Behind him, the shed's remains collapsed with a final groan, sending a pillar of embers spiraling into the pre-dawn sky. No wind carried them. They rose in perfect unison, forming a constellation that pulsed once before winking out. The sudden darkness pressed against Eli's eardrums like a physical weight. Then, a sound, not from the ashes, from the trees. A plastic click. Eli turned slowly. 20 yards into the pines, something gleamed between the roots of a lightning-scarred Douglas fir, a child's bracelet, its clasp bent outward, identical to the one he'd found 3 days ago. The plastic shone wetly, as if freshly dropped. Eli's boots crunched over frost that hadn't been there moments ago as he approached. His breath hitched when he saw the tiny handprint pressed into the moss beside it, too large for a child's, fingers splayed at impossible angles. The bracelet pulsed faintly in Eli's palm, not a trick of the light, but an actual rhythmic throb like a weak heartbeat. The plastic was warm, too warm. He dropped it with a hiss just as the handprint in the moss darkened, sinking deeper into the earth as though pressed by an invisible weight. Above him, the Douglas fir's branches creaked despite the windless air. Needles rained down in slow motion, each one bisecting the pre-dawn light like tiny knives. Eli crouched lower, scanning the tree line. The silence was wrong, not empty, but holding something back. His knife trembled in his grip, its silver edge catching the first pale hints of dawn. Then the radio crackled to life, inside his pocket. Eli recoiled, nearly dropping the blade as the sound warped through layers of denim and sweat-damp fabric. He hadn't carried a radio since the gas station. The static resolved into overlapping whispers, not voices now, but wet, clicking syllables that echoed the creature's joint-popping movements. The fir tree's shadow stretched suddenly long across the forest floor, its outline blurring at the edges like smoke. Eli's fingers closed around the phantom radio in his pocket, not plastic, but something spongy and warm that pulsed against his palm. He yanked his hand free, expecting viscera, but only dawn light dripped from his fingers. The clicking static intensified, now emanating from the bracelet at his feet. Its plastic surface rippled like disturbed water. The Douglas fir's shadow twitched. Not a trick of the light, an actual spasm along the ground, the silhouette of branches rearranging into something approximating limbs. Eli backed away, knife raised, as the first true rays of sunlight crested the ridge. Where light met shadow, the tree's outline held perfectly still while its darkened half continued moving, roots twisting upward with the sound of tearing cambium. The bracelet skittered toward the disturbed earth, pulled by invisible threads. Eli stomped down, pinning it under his boot, only for the plastic to melt like wax, seeping between the treads. A child's laughter bubbled up from the soil, cut short by a wet gurgle. The fir tree's shadow arm lashed out, grasping at Eli's ankle with fingers of cold darkness. Silver flashed. The knife severed shadow from tree with a sound like a guillotine through smoke. Daylight won. Eli staggered back as sunlight flooded the clearing, the severed shadow dissolving into tendrils of black vapor that scattered like startled insects. The bracelet was gone, only a dark stain remained on the moss, its edges still steaming faintly. His knife, now dulled with soot and something viscous, dripped onto the pine needles with a sound like rainwater. The radio static in his pocket ceased abruptly. Eli exhaled, watching his breath fog the air despite the growing warmth of dawn. His fingers trembled as he wiped the blade against his thigh, leaving a streak that evaporated before it could soak into the fabric. Behind him, the shed's ashes smoldered quietly, no longer blue but an ordinary orange. A twig snapped. Eli spun, blade raised, but it was just a mule deer, its ears twitching as it regarded him with liquid black eyes. Normal, unafraid. The sight should have been comforting. Instead, Eli's stomach tightened. The forest around them was too still, the usual morning chorus of birds absent. Even the deer's breathing seemed muted, its sides rising and falling without sound. The deer blinked once, slow, deliberate, then turned its head with mechanical precision until its antlers framed Eli's reflection in its obsidian eyes. The image warped unnaturally, his knife arm elongated, his mouth stretched too wide in a silent scream. Eli recoiled just as the creature's jaw unhinged with a wet crack, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth spiraling down its throat. A raven cawed overhead. The sound snapped the deer's head upward so violently its neck vertebrae popped. In that split second of distraction, Eli lunged sideways, rolling behind a moss-covered boulder as the creature's antlers gouged the space where his chest had been. Splinters of stone rained down as he scrambled backward, boots sliding in the damp earth. The knife's edge caught the first true sunlight, casting a jagged silver line across the deer's flank. The creature froze. Its nostrils flared, sniffing at the air where the blade's reflection had touched it. Smoke curled from the contact point, not the acrid stench of burning hair but something sweeter like smoldering parchment. The deer's hide split along the silver line, peeling back to reveal muscle tissue pulsing with black veins. No blood, just that same iridescent ooze from the shed. Eli's breath hitched. He pressed the knife flat against the boulder, letting its edge scrape rock. The sound sent the deer thing spasming backward, its legs folding at unnatural angles as it crab-walked up the Douglas fir's trunk. Bark split beneath its cloven hooves, raining down chunks of amber sap that hardened midair into jagged obsidian shards. One grazed Eli's cheek, drawing a bead of blood that ran strangely thick, more tar than crimson. The deer thing reached the fir's uppermost branches, its silhouette warping against the dawn sky, antlers elongating, spine twisting like wet rope. Eli crouched lower behind the boulder, pressing the knife's hilt against his pounding carotid. His blood smeared the silver in sluggish streaks that evaporated before hitting the ground. A single raven landed on the boulder's edge, tilting its head to examine Eli's reflection in the knife. The bird's beak opened, not to caw, but to release a perfect droplet of black fluid that struck the blade with a ping. The sound echoed like a struck tuning fork. Above them, the deer thing shuddered violently, its front legs spasming into something closer to arms. Eli didn't wait. He lunged sideways just as the creature detached from the tree in a shower of splintered bark. It hit the ground with all the grace of a marionette with cut strings, limbs splaying at impossible angles before snapping upright. The raven took flight as the deer thing's muzzle split vertically, peeling back to reveal a wet red cavern of spiraling teeth. The knife flashed. Silver met antler with a sound like shattering ice. The creature recoiled, black ooze spraying from the cracked horn, but Eli barely registered the burning pain where droplets seared through his sleeve. His entire focus narrowed to the deer thing's exposed throat, where Javier's tattoo pulsed beneath paper-thin skin. The tattoo pulsed, not inked skin, but something alive beneath it, writhing like a trapped worm. Eli drove the knife forward. At the last second, the deer thing's head snapped sideways, jaws unhinging wide enough to swallow the blade whole. Teeth closed around Eli's wrist with a crunch of bone. Pain exploded up his arm, not the clean burn of silver, but a deep, marrow-deep cold that turned his veins to ice. Eli gagged as the deer thing's throat convulsed around his fist, swallowing the knife inch by inch. Its breath smelled of wet leaves and spoiled milk. The tattoo on its neck stretched grotesquely, forming Javier's screaming face in reverse beneath the skin. Eli's fingers spasmed open. The knife tumbled down the creature's gullet with a wet thud. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then the deer thing's stomach bloated outward, its ribcage creaking like bending green wood. Eli wrenched his arm free just as the first silver tip punched through the creature's belly, not blood, but black smoke pouring from the wound. The deer thing staggered, its front legs buckling as the knife worked its way upward through intestines, lungs, finally wedging in the sternum with a grind of bone on metal. The creature's jaw worked soundlessly, spit dangling in iridescent strands. Then it collapsed sideways, its body deflating like a punctured wineskin until only the knife remained, embedded in a puddle of viscous black fluid that bubbled and steamed. The knife steamed where it lay, its silver blade blackened with residue that evaporated in curling tendrils. Eli clutched his mangled wrist to his chest, watching as the last of the deer thing's flesh dissolved into a dark stain across the moss. The raven circled overhead once before alighting on the knife's hilt, pecking at it with unsettling precision. A gust of wind stirred the pines, the first natural movement Eli had witnessed in hours. The needles whispered secrets overhead, their shadows dappling the ground where the creature had fallen. Then the raven froze mid-peck, its head snapping toward Eli with sudden intensity. Its beak opened. What came out wasn't a caw, but Javier's voice, perfectly replicated. "Silver's no good once it's inside." Eli stumbled backward as the raven took flight, the knife tumbling free with a metallic clatter. The blade landed edge down, embedding itself upright in the soft earth like a grave marker. Around it, the black stain pulsed once before seeping into the ground, leaving only a perfect circle of dead moss. Eli's wrist throbbed where the deer thing's teeth had punctured flesh. No blood, just a slow seep of black fluid that evaporated before it could drip. He reached for the embedded knife with his good hand, fingers hovering over the hilt. The raven's warning echoed in his skull. Silver's no good once it's inside. The blade vibrated faintly, humming against his calluses like a live wire. A twig snapped behind him. Eli whirled, expecting another monstrosity, but the clearing remained empty save for the raven circling overhead. Then he saw it. His own shadow stretched long across the moss, its edges fraying like smoke, except he wasn't standing in sunlight. The silhouette moved independently, raising an arm he hadn't lifted. The knife came free with a wet pop. Eli barely had time to register the warmth seeping up his arm before his shadow lunged. He sidestepped on instinct, but the darkness flowed around his boots like ink in water, coalescing into a perfect mimic of his stance. When Eli raised the knife, his shadow mirrored the motion with a blade of pure void. The raven dive-bombed the shadow, talons raking through darkness that reformed instantly. Its call morphed mid-flight into Javier's voice. Ash, use the, before the shadow's elongated hand snatched the bird from the air. Feathers exploded in a burst of black mist. Eli's breath hitched as the raven's remains dissolved into wisps of shadow. The knife trembled in his grip, not from fear, but from something deeper, like the silver recognized what stood opposite him. His shadow smiled with teeth he didn't have, its edges bleeding into the moss like spilled ink. The first move came from beneath. Eli barely registered the moss shifting before shadow tendrils lashed around his ankles, colder than creek water. He slashed downward, severing one tendril with a sound like tearing wet paper. The severed end writhed before dissolving, but two more immediately replaced it, slithering up his calves with deliberate precision. His reflection in the knife's blade showed the truth. The shadow wasn't just mimicking him, it was unwrapping him, layer by layer. The uniform stitches at his shoulders frayed without touch, his nameplate tarnished mid-breath. Eli remembered Javier's warning about silver losing potency and did the only thing left. He plunged the knife into his own thigh. Pain flared white-hot, but the effect was instantaneous. The shadow recoiled as if yanked by strings, its form rippling like disturbed water. Where Eli's blood dripped onto the moss, tiny tongues of blue flame flickered to life. The shadow's edges crisped, curling like burning film. It hissed, not a sound but a vacuum where sound should be, and for one glorious second, Eli thought it might dissolve entirely. The shadow didn't dissolve. It split, one half recoiling from Eli's blood-soaked knife, while the other surged up his leg like spilled ink climbing a windshield. Cold seeped through his pants where it touched, turning denim stiff with frost. His breath came in ragged clouds now, the clearing's temperature dropping by the second. The blue flames from his blood flickered out one by one, their light swallowed by the advancing darkness. Eli wrenched the knife free from his thigh with a wet schlick. Fresh blood pattered onto the moss, each drop hissing where it landed. The shadow hesitated, its edges vibrating like a mirage, then lunged again. This time Eli was ready. He slashed horizontally, cleaving through the shadow's midsection. The blade met no resistance, but the effect was immediate. The upper half of the shadow froze mid-lunge, its outstretched fingers inches from Eli's face. A terrible silence filled the clearing. Even the raven's scattered feathers hung suspended in the air, frozen like insects in amber. Then, a sound. Not from the shadow, but from the knife itself. A high-pitched whine building in the steel, vibrating up Eli's arm until his teeth ached. The shadow's bisected halves trembled in unison, their edges fraying like burnt paper. Eli's reflection warped in the knife's blade, his eyes hollowing, his mouth stretching impossibly wide in a silent scream. He tried to release the hilt, but his fingers had fused to the metal, skin bonding with silver in a seamless weld. The whine peaked, shattering the unnatural stillness as both shadow halves recoiled, not in attack now, but in something disturbingly like recognition. The knife's whine became a scream, human, unmistakably Eli's own voice, as the silver blade liquefied in his grip. Molten metal dripped between his fingers without burning, pooling in his palm like quicksilver before reshaping itself into something new, a crude hand mirror, its edges jagged as if torn from a larger whole. The shadow's reflection didn't appear in the glass. Only Eli's hollowed eyes stared back, his pupils contracting as the mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. Behind him, the bisected shadow collapsed inward with a sound like 1,000 pages turning at once. Its darkness condensed into a single black pearl that hovered momentarily before dropping onto the moss with an audible plink. The raven's feathers disintegrated into blue ash mid-fall. Eli's breath came too fast. The mirror's glass frosted over where his blood smeared the rim, forming intricate patterns that resembled pine needles. When he tilted it, the reflection shifted, not showing his face anymore, but the maintenance shed from earlier, its door swinging open to reveal an endless tunnel of stitched clothing receding into blackness. Javier's voice whispered from the glass, "Almost dawn." The pearl pulsed where it lay, its surface fracturing like thin ice beneath a boot. Eli crouched slowly, watching his distorted reflection in the mirror, and reached for it. The moment his shadow touched the pearl, the forest exhaled. Every pine needle within 50 yards vibrated in unison, releasing droplets of dew that hung suspended in the air like a million tiny lenses. In each one, Eli saw a different fractured moment. The missing child dropping her bracelet, Rick Torres zipping his tent shut from the outside, Javier pressing the silver knife into his palm with hands already beginning to molt. The pearl shattered with the sound of a windshield cracking. Black smoke geysered upward, twisting into the shape of a towering stag made of storm clouds and static. Its antlers branched endlessly, each tine splitting into smaller versions of itself until the entire clearing was crisscrossed with ghostly replicas. The mirror in Eli's hand turned ice cold. He watched, paralyzed, as the smokestag lowered its head toward him, not to attack, but in something resembling a bow. From the mirror's surface, Javier's reflection reached out and seized the stag's antler. The smoke dispersed instantly, leaving only the scent of ozone and wet fur. The clearing fell still. Even the suspended dewdrops hung motionless. Then movement, not from the mirror but from Eli's own hands. His fingers moved without his consent, turning the mirror face down over the shattered pearl's remains. The glass sank into the moss like quicksand, pulling Eli's arm down with terrifying force. He resisted. The mirror resisted harder. His elbow joint popped audibly as the reflection inside changed again, now showing the creature's true form in negative. Elongated limbs, too many joints, patches of stitched skin sloughing off to reveal the writhing darkness beneath. Javier's voice came warped through the glass. "Look closer." Eli looked. The reflection shifted once more, not the creature now, but himself. His own face stared back, hollow-eyed and bleeding from identical claw marks. The mirror Eli smiled with teeth too sharp, then reached through the glass. Fingers of smoke and static closed around Eli's wrist. Cold seared up his arm like frozen lightning. Somewhere beyond the pain, Eli understood. The silver knife had never been a weapon, it was a key. The creature wasn't hunting him, it was testing him. And now, as dawn's first true light crested the ridge, the final door stood open. Eli stopped resisting. He let the mirror pull him forward until his forehead touched glass. The surface gave way like thin ice, and the forest swallowed him whole. The mirror pulled Eli through with a sound like tearing parchment, not the sharp rip of paper, but the slow, wet separation of skin from muscle. His vision inverted. The forest's greens and browns bled into negatives, shadows becoming light, tree trunks stretching into skeletal fingers against a starless sky. He landed on all fours, palms sinking into something warm and fibrous. When he lifted his hands, strands of moss clung to his fingers like torn stitches. The clearing was gone. Or rather, it was still there, but wrong. The pines stood in perfect geometric rows, their branches too symmetrical, needles arranged in fractal patterns that hurt to look at. Between them hung the missing. Rick Torres mid-scream, his face stretched over a ribcage like canvas on a frame. The child's plastic bracelet floating in a bubble of amber resin. Javier's uniform, neatly pressed and suspended from nothing, its sleeves twitching as if inhabited by invisible arms. Eli's breath fogged in the air despite the warmth. The mirror lay shattered at his feet, its glass shards reflecting not the scene around him, but his own face from different angles, each showing a progressively more distorted version. His left eye sinking into his skull, his mouth unhinging vertically, his Parks badge melting into his collarbone. He kicked the fragments away. They tinkled like wind chimes before going silent. The creature emerged from between the trees not as a predator, but as a supplicant, head bowed, elongated limbs folded inward like broken wings. Its hide was no longer patched with stolen skin, just a shifting mosaic of shadows and bark textures that refused to hold one shape. Where its face should have been hung Javier's badge, dangling from a frayed strap that pulsed like an umbilical cord. Eli's fingers found the wound in his thigh where the knife had gone in. His blood had stopped flowing, the edges of the gash already knitting together with silvery threads that shimmered when he tilted his leg. The creature mirrored his movement, its form rippling in response. It wasn't mimicking him anymore. It was answering. "You're not hunting me," Eli whispered. His voice came out doubled, his own tenor overlaid with Javier's gravel tones. The words disturbed the air like a stone dropped in still water, sending concentric rings of distortion through the false forest. The pines wavered at their passage, their fractal branches recoiling like startled spiders. The creature's elongated fingers unfolded like fern fronds in spring, each joint whispering secrets as they moved. Its chest split vertically, not with violence, but the inevitability of a seed pod bursting, revealing not organs but a hollow space where a human heart might beat. Suspended within floated Javier's silver knife, pristine despite the black ichor that had stained it earlier. The blade turned slowly, catching light that shouldn't exist in this inverted forest. "Not stolen," the creature said, or didn't say. The words formed in Eli's mind like memories surfacing. "Returned." Its voice was the creak of pines in wind, the scrape of bark against bark. The knife rotated again, showing Eli's reflection warped across the flat of the blade, his face stitched together with patches of Rick's stubble, the child's freckles, Javier's crow's feet. Eli's breath hitched. The claw marks on his collarbone burned suddenly cold. He reached for the knife, then hesitated as the creature's form rippled, not in threat, but in what might have been laughter. Around them, the geometric pines swayed without wind, their fractal branches tracing the same symbol over and over in the air. A spiral, a noose, a womb. "You were never prey," the forest murmured through the creature's shifting mouth. The words tasted of pine resin and copper on Eli's tongue. "Only possibility." The knife floated closer. Eli's fingers twitched, not to grasp it but in recognition. The silver wasn't just metal anymore. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the veins in his wrist, the same tempo as the creature's breathing. When he finally touched the hilt, warmth flooded up his arm like sunlight through old growth. The clearing inverted again. Eli's knees hit soft earth, real earth, rich with decomposing needles and mycelium. Morning light filtered through canopy gaps in dusty shafts. The creature stood before him, no longer monstrous but not quite human either, a silhouette of dappled shadows and sunlight, its edges blurring where forest met flesh. Javier's badge still hung from its neck, but the nameplate now read Vargas. "Every 50 years, the creature whispered, its voice the sound of wind through cedar boughs, the land chooses a new keeper. It gestured toward Eli's thigh wound, not bleeding, but blooming with tiny white mycelial threads that wove his skin back together. The knife always finds its way home. Eli's breath caught as understanding crashed over him. The disappearances, the mimicry, not predation, but purification. The forest had been testing him since the moment he picked up that child's bracelet. Every horror had been a reflection of his own choices. His willingness to abandon protocol for a stranger, his refusal to leave Javier behind even when logic screamed to run. The creature extended one elongated hand, not to take but to offer. Nestled in its palm lay the plastic bracelet, its clasp now perfectly intact. "She's waiting by the creek," it said. When Eli reached for it, his fingers passed through the creature's form like mist. Morning birdsong swelled as the shadows comprising its body dispersed into sunlight. Eli stumbled downhill toward the sound of running water, each step lighter than the last. His uniform hung in tatters, but the wounds beneath had sealed with silvery scars that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The trees whispered as he passed, their branches bending to brush his shoulders like old friends. The creek clearing held no signs of struggle, no claw marks, no blood-stained moss. Just a freckled girl in a yellow raincoat crouched by the water's edge, turning over rocks with careful fingers. Her wrist bore no bracelet. When she looked up at Eli's approach, her eyes held none of the terror he'd expected. "You found it," she said, pointing to his clenched fist. Eli uncurled his fingers. The plastic bracelet lay coiled in his palm, warm as living flesh. As the girl reached for it, the clasp clicked open of its own accord, revealing an inscription along the inner curve he'd never noticed before: Protector's Pledge. The moment it settled around her wrist, the creek's babble resolved into words, not human speech, but something deeper, older, the language of roots and rainfall. Behind them the forest exhaled. Shadows pooled at the tree line, not threatening but watchful. The girl, Lena, her name came to him suddenly, tilted her head as if listening. "It says you have to choose now," she translated, water dripping from her fingertips in perfect silver spheres. "Stay with them or go back." Eli's badge weighed heavy on his chest. He touched it absently, feeling the metal thrum beneath his fingers. When he looked down, the enamel had changed. No longer the Park Service pine tree emblem, but an intricate knot of roots and antlers. His reflection in the creek showed two possibilities superimposed: Ranger Vargas in his crisp uniform, and something wilder, greener, with bark-textured skin. The choice crystallized with terrifying clarity. He could return to headquarters, radio and the missing persons found, let the paperwork bury the truth. Or he could step into the water and let the current rewrite him bone deep. The truck's engine stuttered as Eli glanced at the rearview mirror, just once, just long enough to see the impossible. The maintenance shed stood pristine, its aluminum siding gleaming under noon sun where charred wreckage should have been. And there, framed in the doorway, his own silhouette. No, not his. Close enough. The figure raised a hand in farewell, fingers stretching like warm taffy, the cuff of his uniform sleeve sliding back to reveal bark-textured skin beneath. Eli stomped the accelerator. Tires spat gravel. When he risked another glance, the mirror showed only empty road. His hands trembled against the wheel, the silver scars along his palms pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The radio remained stubbornly silent, its dial stuck between stations despite his frantic twisting. The rearview mirror showed the forest collapsing in on itself, not with destruction, but with the quiet precision of origami folding back into blank paper. Trees bent at their middles, branches curling inward like the ribs of closing umbrellas. The shed's aluminum siding rippled once, then flattened into unbroken wilderness. By the time Eli blinked, the landscape matched his yellowed patrol maps from 1973 exactly. No footpaths, no blazes, just ancient ponderosas standing sentinel over ferns that hadn't been trampled in half a century. His hands tightened on the wheel. The scars across his palms itched, not painfully but persistently, like new bark forming over a wound. Static fizzed through the truck's speakers, resolving momentarily into a voice that wasn't quite Javier's. "You left your hat." Eli's gaze flicked to the passenger seat where his Ranger Stetson sat perfectly centered, its brim dusted with pine needles that hadn't been there when he'd fled. The scent of damp cedar filled the cab. A deer bolted across the road, a real one this time, brown-eyed and breathing, and Eli slammed the brakes. The tires screeched, the radio squealed, and the hat tumbled to the floorboards. When he looked up, the animal stood frozen in the middle of the asphalt, its flanks heaving. Not in fear, in recognition. Sunlight glinted off its antlers, casting prismatic shadows that resolved into letters across the dashboard. "Look back." The deer's eyes locked onto Eli's, too dark, too knowing, before it vanished into the undergrowth. His foot hovered over the accelerator. Static whispered through the radio again, forming words that slithered between frequencies. "You always were terrible at following orders." Eli stomped the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting asphalt. He kept his gaze fixed on the double yellow lines ahead, ignoring how they pulsed faintly in his peripheral vision. His reflection in the rearview mirror showed his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, but the eyes staring back were calm. Too calm, like still water before the storm's surge. He hit the county highway doing 60. Normalcy reasserted itself in increments. A Dairy Queen billboard missing half its letters, a rusted pickup hauling hay bales, the distant wail of a train whistle. The scars on his palms itched worse now, the silver threads beneath his skin vibrating in time with the engine's rumble. When he flexed his fingers, The steering wheel left indentations in his flesh that took too long to fade. The third symbol breaks. The old man in the brown corduroy jacket smelled like dust and mothballs, the kind that clung to library stacks nobody visited anymore. He pushed a pair of wire-framed glasses up his nose with a knobby finger, squinting at the ledger in front of him like it might bite. "You're sure you want box 47? He rasped. "Most folks ask for the mission records, or the Gold Rush diaries." "I'm sure," I said, tapping my pen against the request slip. The university basement hummed with the wheeze of an overworked HVAC system, the air thick with the metallic tang of old pipes. Box 47 was smaller than I expected, a dented tin container shoved behind a stack of water-damaged land deeds. The latch gave way with a reluctant screech. Inside, wrapped in brittle buckskin, was a bundle of pages so fragile I held my breath as I peeled them apart. The ink had bled in places, but the Comanche symbols were unmistakable, jagged lines like claw marks, circling a figure with too many limbs. My pulse kicked when I recognized the word Mupit scrawled in the margin, "Rot." The first page was dated 1742, the handwriting uneven as if the author's hand had been shaking. "I, Red Hawk, son of burning grass, write this so the people will remember," it began. "3 moons ago, little bird went to gather sage and did not return. We found her basket by the river, the leaves inside still green. No tracks, no blood, only the smell of wet fur where she had stood." The words coiled in my gut. This wasn't just folklore. This was a confession. "Then came the others," the text continued. "Swift deer, old bear, their bodies were wrong when we found them, faces slack like empty masks. Gray wolf touched swift deer's chest and his fingers came away black with mold, though the man had been dead less than a day." The page trembled in my grip. The elder gathered us beneath the painted buffalo hide. His hands, knotted with age, trembled as he passed the pipe. "It walks among us," he said. "It takes the shape of the dead, but the eyes are never right. You will see teeth where teeth should not be." The firelight carved hollows beneath his cheeks. Outside, the wind carried whispers, not through the trees but between them. A voice mimicking little bird's laughter, though we had buried her bones days before. Gray Wolf led me to the sweat lodge at dawn. The air inside was thick with sage and something darker, metallic, like old blood drying on stone. He pressed a bundle of crushed herbs into my palm, bitter, stinging my nostrils. "Paint the symbols with this," he said, dragging his thumb over my forehead. The mixture burned, seeping into my skin. "Left, right, above. The chant must not break or it will know." His eyes flickered to the entrance where the morning sun cast long shadows. "It is strongest at dusk when the light forgets the land." The cave stank of wet fur and spoiled meat long before I saw its jagged mouth. Scraps of cloth clung to the rocks, frayed edges trembling in the wind, not from the breeze, but from something inside breathing against them. My fingers shook as I smeared the first symbol, the paste bubbling where it touched the stone. The chant spilled from my lips, hoarse. Behind me, a twig snapped. Not a twig. The sound was too wet, too deliberate, like a tooth cracking bone. I kept chanting, fingers smearing the second symbol as sweat stung my eyes. The cave exhaled, a gust of warm air reeking of copper and spoiled milk. Then the voice came, "Red Hawk." It was little bird-esque but stretched thin, the way a child might mimic speech after hearing it only once. The syllables dripped. "You left me in the dark." Something scraped against stone, not from the cave's throat, but from just behind me, close enough to stir the hairs on my neck. I didn't turn. Gray Wolf's warning throbbed in my skull. "Look, and it wears your face next." The third symbol blurred as my hands shook. The paste had gone tacky, clinging to my fingers like sap. I pressed it to the rock above the entrance, the chant fraying into a whisper. The wind died. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a sound like wet leather splitting. A hand clamped my shoulder, fingers too long, the nails blackened and curved. Little bird's sleeve flapped loose around its wrist, the fabric straining over something knotted and wrong beneath. "Look at me," it breathed. The voice was hers, but underneath it something chittered. I lunged forward, finishing the symbol with a final word. The thing screamed not in rage but in recognition as the symbols flared red-hot. The cave mouth shuddered, dust cascading from the rocks like a sigh. The grip on my shoulder wrenched me backward, claws snagging my shirt. I twisted, glimpsing a face that was and wasn't little Bird S. Her braids, her beaded necklace, but the skin beneath stretched taut over a mouth that split too wide, too many teeth glistening like icicles. The symbols burned brighter. The thing howled, its form rippling like heated wax, before the cave entrance collapsed inward with a groan, sealing it inside. Gray Wolf found me retching in the dirt, my hands blackened with the remnants of the paste. He didn't speak, only pressed a trembling palm to the sealed stones. They were warm, pulsing faintly under his touch. "Stone crumbles," he said at last, eyes shadowed. "Time forgets." The wind carried the scent of sage and something sour, like milk left too long in the sun. Back at camp, the others avoided my gaze. The children clutched their mother's legs, their wide eyes flickering to the fresh marks on my forehead, 3 jagged lines, raised and angry. Gray Wolf burned my stained shirt in silence, the flames licking at the fabric with unnatural hunger. That night no one slept. The wind brought no more whispers, only the distant, hollow thump of something beating against stone, muffled but insistent, like a heart, like a fist. The manuscript ended abruptly, the final page torn near the binding. My hands left damp fingerprints on the vellum as I turned it over, searching for more. Nothing. Just that single, unfinished warning from Gray Wolf and the creeping certainty that this wasn't history. It was a timer. 2 weeks later, I stood at the edge of Big Ben's backcountry, GPS blinking erratically. The park ranger had laughed when I asked about caves near the Comanche Springs. "That's rattlesnake country," he'd said, slapping a map onto the counter. "And if the snakes don't get you, the heat will." He didn't mention skinwalkers. The hike took 4 hours longer than it should have. The trail vanished into scrub, then into nothing at all, as if the land itself was resisting me. By the time the GPS chirped, destination reached, the sun hung low, bleeding into the horizon. The cave mouth wasn't where it should have been. It was above me, jagged and dark, halfway up a crumbling cliff face. I scraped my palms raw climbing, the rock warm under my fingers. The stink hit me first, not the dry musk of bat guano but the cloying sweetness of spoiled meat. Then I saw them, the symbols. 2 remained, carved deep into the stone, their edges worn smooth by time. The third was obliterated, the rock beneath it split clean through as if struck by lightning. Or claws. A gust of wind moaned through the cave, carrying with it a sound that stopped my breath. Click, click, click. Like a tongue tapping teeth. Like something testing the air. I fumbled for my headlamp, but the batteries were dead. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching toward the cave like fingers. The clicking grew louder, rhythmic now, click, 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 punctuated by a wet, guttural inhale. Something moved inside the darkness. Not a shape, a shifting like fabric stretched over too many joints. The stench rolled out in waves, rancid and thick. My hands found the torn manuscript page in my pocket, the one I hadn't shown anyone. The one with Red Hawk's last words. The seal breaks from the outside. Behind me a twig snapped, too wet, too deliberate. The cave exhaled. And the clicking stopped. I didn't turn, not yet, because every muscle in my body had locked rigid. My breath came shallow, tasting of dust and that cloying rot spilling from the cave's maw. The headlamp's dead weight swung against my chest as I tilted my head just enough to catch movement in my periphery. A shadow detaching itself from the cliff face, too fluid to be rock. The manuscript page crumpled in my fist. Gray Wolf's warning thrummed in my skull, "Look, and it wears your face next," but survival instincts screamed louder. I pivoted on my heel, the movement jerky with panic. The thing stood 7 feet away, silhouetted against the dying sun. It wore the ranger's khaki shirt, the fabric straining across shoulders that bulged wrong, like sacks of wet gravel shifting beneath the cloth. His hat sat askew, revealing a scalp puckered with something glistening and dark beneath the brim. "You lost," It asked in the ranger's drawl, but the voice bubbled, like tar boiling under the words. My throat clenched. The cave's exhale stirred the hair at my nape, carrying that wet clicking sound again, closer now, synchronized. The thing cocked its head, too far, the neck tendons popping audibly, and smiled with the ranger's teeth. Except they weren't teeth anymore. They were longer, crowding the mouth in jagged rows, the gums black and weeping. Behind me, the cave groaned. Stone grated against stone as the remaining symbols began to smolder, the air rippling above them like heat haze. The thing's grin widened at the sound, its eyes reflecting the dimming light in oily crescents. "Funny thing," it said, taking a step forward. The boot sank too deep into the sand as if the foot inside had no bones. "You folk always come right at sunset." The first symbol cracked apart with a sound like a gunshot. The thing lunged, not at me, but past me, toward the cave, its limbs unfolding with a wet, fibrous tearing. The last thing I saw before running was the manuscript page fluttering from my grip, the blood-brown word facing up as it spiraled into the sand. Run. And I did. My legs pumped before my brain caught up, boots kicking up sand as I bolted toward the scrub. Behind me, the cave belched a stench like ruptured bowels, hot and sour. The thing's laughter chased me, the ranger's voice fraying into wet clicks. Then silence. That was worse. I didn't dare glance back until I hit the tree line. The cliff face loomed in the distance, the cave's mouth now a yawning void. No movement, no ranger-shaped horror. Just the symbols, two still smoking, the third's remained scattered across the ground like broken teeth. The GPS beeped weakly in my pocket. Dead. The sun had bled out, leaving the desert in twilight's violet grip. Shadows pooled between the mesquite trees, thick enough to hide anything. I forced myself to breathe through my nose. No sound, no scent but dust and creosote. Then the wind shifted. It came from the east. A child's giggle, high and bright. The same pitch as little birds in Red Hawk's account. My muscles locked. The giggle spiraled into a wet cough, then a sigh. "Don't you want to see?" it cooed, close enough to stir the hairs on my neck. Not from the cave, from behind the nearest boulder. I backed away, heel catching on a root. The fall saved me. The thing's arm, too long, jointed wrong, swiped through the space where my head had been. Fabric flapped. A child's tattered dress, the hem crusted black. It crouched on all fours now, head lolling to reveal little bird's face inverted, her braids dragging through the dirt like worms. Her mouth unhinged with a pop, a second set of teeth nested inside. "Gray Wolf lied," it whispered. "The chant's the key. Say it backwards and—" A rock struck its temple with a hollow thunk. It whipped around with a serpent's speed, but I was already moving, scrambling toward a cluster of boulders. The thing didn't follow. It was listening. Head cocked toward the canyon where the first stars pricked the sky. Then it flowed into the shadows, dress dissolving into the dark. I pressed against the cool stone, trembling. That's when I felt it, a tremor beneath my palms. The boulder vibrated faintly, rhythmically, like something massive breathing underneath. The manuscript had missed one crucial detail. Skinwalkers don't hunt alone. The realization hit me as the boulder's vibration synced with a second pulse from the canyon. A third answered from the scrublands to the west, a deep, subcutaneous thrumming that sent pebbles skittering across the ground. The desert wasn't empty. It was waiting. I pressed my back to the stone, scanning for movement. Moonlight bleached the landscape silver, turning every creosote bush into a crouching silhouette. Something scraped against rock nearby, the sound of chitin dragging over sandstone. Then a whisper, this time in Gray Wolf's voice. "The symbols are failing." A shadow detached itself from the cliff face, tall and warped. Not the ranger, not little bird. This one moved with a hunter's patience, its outline blurring at the edges like smoke. It paused 10 yards away, head tilting as if sniffing the air. Moonlight caught the curve of its spine, too many vertebrae stacked crooked as fallen fence posts. I held my breath. The thing's shoulders hitched in a soundless laugh, then it melted sideways into the dark. The canyon's pulse quickened. I risked a glance toward the cave. The remaining symbols glowed faintly, their light dimming with each throb from below. A figure stood between them, human-shaped, but wrong in ways my brain refused to process. It pressed skeletal hands against the invisible barrier, the air warping around its fingertips like heat over asphalt. The final symbol cracked with a sound like ice splitting. The figure stepped forward, and the desert inhaled. Every shadow convulsed at once, the darkness birthing shapes that slithered and jerked upright. They converged on the cave, a procession of nightmares wearing tattered skins, a woman with a jaw unhinged like a snake's, a child walking on backwards knees, something that might have been a bear if not for the too many eyes glistening beneath its fur. The lead figure stretched its arms wide, the motion sending a chorus of wet pops down its spine. It threw back its head, Red Hawk's face, Red Hawk's braids, and screamed in a dozen voices at once. The sound wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was the noise a mountain makes when it decides to bury you alive. The symbols flared once, bright as magnesium, then shattered. The thing wearing Red Hawk's skin turned its head toward me, smiling with teeth that hadn't been in the manuscript. "Time's up," it said in Grey Wolf's voice. And the pack charged. They moved like liquid shadow, limbs elongating, faces splitting into grotesque grins as the last of the seal's light guttered out. The thing wearing Red Hawk's skin reached me first, its fingers brushing my throat, cold and slick like gutted fish. I recoiled, but the ground gave way beneath me, sand sliding into the canyon below. The fall knocked the air from my lungs, and for a heartbeat there was silence. Then the whispers began. Not from above, from inside the rock. The boulders pulsed around me, their surfaces blistering with shapes that pressed outward, faces, hands, mouths stretched in silent screams. The manuscript's final page fluttered down beside me, landing face up in the dirt. The blood-scrawled run had changed. A new word bubbled beneath it, written in something fresh and dark. Join. The skinwalker's breath gusted against my neck, rank with decay. Its voice was a chorus now, Red Hawk, Little Bird, the Ranger, all layered over that wet, clicking tongue. "You opened the door," it crooned. "Now walk through." Its hand settled on my shoulder, the weight unbearable, final. Above us, the moon vanished behind a swarm of twisting bodies. The desert sighed content. I closed my eyes. The chanting began, not mine, not Grey Wolf's, theirs, and this time there was no seal left to break. The fingers on my shoulder dug deeper, not with pain, but with purpose. My skin rippled where they touched, the flesh beneath turning soft, malleable. I tried to scream, but my jaw unhinged with a wet pop, the sound lost in the chorus of clicking tongues and splitting sinew. The world blurred, colors leaching into grays and blacks as my bones melted like wax. The thing leaned in, its breath a rotting hymn in my ear. "This is how we remember." The manuscript had lied about one last thing: skinwalkers weren't trapped. They were waiting for someone to read the words, to speak them aloud in the dark, to become the new seal. The desert held its breath as my body folded inward, skin stretching over a shape I couldn't name. The last thing I saw was the cave mouth, gaping wide, empty now, waiting for the next historian, the next fool. And then I was hungry. I'd stories. If you enjoyed them, please leave a like and subscribe.